We ended the last part of this series with a question that sounds simple and turns out to be anything but. As the space around the moon gets busier, who's actually in charge of it? The honest answer starts with an uncomfortable fact. There isn't one answer. There isn't one organization, one country, or one agency you can point to and say, they're responsible for all of it. Instead, there's a growing overlapping list of players, each with their own missions, their own rules, and their own interests. Understanding who they actually are is the first step toward understanding why "who's in charge" doesn't have a clean answer yet. And it helps to keep four separate things straight as we go, because they get blurred together constantly. The international law that technically governs all of this. The individual countries that license and take formal responsibility for what actually gets launched. The space agencies, like NASA, setting their own program-level policy on top of that. And the real-time operational coordination of who's actually where, doing what, right now. Having one of those doesn't mean you have the other three. Let's start with the most obvious category, countries. The United States, through NASA's Artemis program, is the most visible player around the moon right now, and its ambitions have grown well past a single crewed landing. As of this recording, 70 nations have signed on to something called the Artemis Accords, a set of shared principles for how countries should behave around the moon, covering things like transparency about missions, avoiding interference with other nations' activities, and, notably for this series, commitments to plan for the safe, timely disposal of space debris. But here's the detail that matters most. The Artemis Accords are non-binding. They're a set of shared commitments, not an enforceable law. Countries agree to follow them voluntarily, and two of the world's major spacefaring nations haven't signed on at all. China and Russia have both publicly rejected the accords, describing them as a framework built around one country's priorities rather than genuine international consensus. Instead, they're building their own parallel effort, a China-led initiative called the International Lunar Research Station, actively recruiting its own separate group of partner nations. So even at the level of which countries agree on the rules, there isn't one shared answer. There are two competing coalitions, operating in the same physical space, under two different sets of voluntary commitments. And that's before you even get to the second major category of players, private companies. We already spent an entire part of this series cataloging the commercial landers currently active around the moon. Intuitive Machines, Firefly Aerospace, Astrobotic, Draper, Blue Origin, and others, most of them flying under NASA-funded contracts. Here's the detail worth sitting with, though. These companies aren't simply extensions of NASA. They're independent businesses, incorporated in specific countries, operating under specific national licenses, with their own commercial interests, their own timelines, and, in some cases, their own customers beyond NASA entirely. That matters because international space law places responsibility for what a company launches onto the country that licensed the launch, not onto some shared, borderless authority. When SpaceX's own upper stage became the subject of this entire series, the relevant legal framework didn't ask, who's responsible in space? It asked, which country authorized this launch? That's the U.S., and under existing treaties, the U.S. bears that responsibility, and the hardware itself, legally, remains SpaceX's own property, even after it's scattered across a crater on the moon. So even the American side of this picture isn't one single actor. It's NASA, plus a growing list of independent companies NASA pays to do the actual flying. And NASA's own footprint around the moon is expanding well beyond individual lander missions. Artemis II already carried a crew on a flyby of the moon earlier this year, the farthest distance any crewed mission has traveled from Earth. Later Artemis missions are working toward an actual crewed landing near the lunar South Pole. NASA has also outlined long-term ambitions for a permanent lunar base, alongside a growing number of robotic landing missions projected in the years immediately ahead. That's not one program anymore. It's an entire architecture: landers, orbiters, relay satellites, eventually a crewed base, being built out piece by piece, by a mix of government planning and commercial execution. So with all of these different players, multiple countries, dozens of companies, competing coalitions, operating in the same limited region of space, what rules do they actually operate under? The foundation is still the Outer Space Treaty, signed back in 1967, decades before any of this activity was remotely plausible. It establishes a few core principles that still apply today. Countries are internationally responsible for the space objects they launch. Ownership of launched hardware doesn't transfer just because it ends up somewhere else. And nations bear liability if their space object causes damage to someone else's property. Notice what that framework doesn't cover. It says nothing about a rocket stage that drifts for a year and a half and eventually strikes an empty, unclaimed patch of the moon. There's no other country's property being damaged. There's no functioning space law today that requires an active disposal maneuver for hardware headed that far from Earth. And it's not even the first attempt at something more comprehensive. Back in 1979, a separate treaty called the Moon Agreement tried to establish a far more detailed international regime for the Moon, including rules for eventually sharing lunar resources. It's still technically enforced today, but only around 17 countries ever ratified it. Not the United States, not Russia, not China, not one nation that currently operates hardware around the Moon. A more ambitious rulebook already existed, decades ago. The countries actually doing the work never signed on to it. The newer Artemis Accords go a step further than the original treaty. Signatory nations do commit, on paper, to planning for the safe and timely disposal of debris, and to limiting the creation of new, long-lived hardware left drifting in space. That's a real, meaningful commitment, but it's voluntary. It only binds the roughly 70 nations that have signed it. And as we already covered, some of the world's most active spacefaring nations aren't among them. So the honest legal picture looks like this. A decades-old treaty that never anticipated this volume of activity, layered with a newer, well-intentioned but non-binding set of commitments that only part of the spacefaring world has agreed to. Which brings us back one more time to 2025-010D. Under the Outer Space Treaty, the wreckage scattered near Einstein crater is still, legally, SpaceX's property. Nobody else acquired it just because it landed somewhere else. The United States, as the licensing country, bears the formal international responsibility for what its launch produced. That's ownership and responsibility. Liability is a related but separate idea, governed by a different treaty. It's about who'd have to pay for damage a space object causes. It barely enters into this particular story at all. The impact site was empty, unclaimed lunar surface, so there's no damaged party and no liability claim to make. And under that same framework, nothing in the treaty framework cited here clearly establishes that this amounts to a violation. SpaceX passivated the stage exactly as required. No treaty currently in force obligated the company to spend additional fuel and payload capacity, reserving a controlled disposal maneuver for hardware this far from Earth. That's an important distinction, and it's worth restating clearly, because it's easy to blur. A regulatory gap is not the same thing as a violation. Nobody broke an existing rule here. What actually happened is that the existing rules were written for an era with far less lunar traffic than the one we're now entering. But even a perfectly updated legal framework wouldn't fully solve this problem on its own. Because rules are only half the picture. The other half is enforcement. Actually knowing, in real time, what's out there, where it's headed, and whether anyone's approaching a collision course. We already talked earlier in this series about how early that infrastructure still is. The tracking program's beginning to take shape. Projects like the Cislunar Highway Patrol System and new long-range tracking techniques being tested by research labs are genuinely promising. But they're early stage, experimental. Not yet the kind of comprehensive, always-on monitoring system you'd need to actually enforce debris commitments, even voluntary ones. So here's the honest state of affairs as of this recording. Some countries have agreed, on paper, to responsible debris practices. Some haven't. And even among those that have, nobody yet has the complete technical ability to verify who's actually following through. Rules without eyes to watch them and hands to enforce them are only half an infrastructure. Let's put the full picture together. Countries operating under two separate competing sets of voluntary agreements. Private companies, licensed nationally, increasingly acting as independent operators rather than simple contractors. A decades-old core treaty never designed for this much traffic. A newer set of debris commitments that only some of the relevant players have signed. and early-stage tracking technology that isn't yet capable of watching, let alone enforcing, any of it. That's not a broken system exactly. It's an incomplete one, built for an era of occasional missions, now being stretched by an era of sustained, overlapping activity it was never designed to handle. The problem isn't that there are no rules. The problem is that rules and infrastructure aren't the same thing. And here's something worth sitting with. Gaps like this rarely get closed by treaties alone. Historically, they get closed by infrastructure. Actual systems, actually built, actually operated. Air traffic control didn't emerge from a single international agreement. It emerged because someone had to build the radar, the towers, the software, and staff them, day after day. The same will likely be true here. Eventually, someone is going to build the tracking networks, the communications relays, and the coordination systems this environment actually needs. Which raises a question we haven't touched at all. Infrastructure like that doesn't build itself, and it doesn't run for free. If cislunar space genuinely needs tracking systems, relay networks, and traffic coordination the way modern highways need traffic lights and radar, someone has to design it, launch it, operate it, and maintain it. Which means somewhere in that gap between the rules we have and the infrastructure we need, there's also a business opportunity. A real one, already forming. This part is about that opportunity, what it actually looks like, who's already building pieces of it, and why an old dead rocket stage, the whole reason this series exists, turns out to be a surprisingly useful lens for understanding it. Because infrastructure sounds abstract until you break it down into what it actually means, in practice, for a place like the moon. Here's a simple way to think about it. When people imagine a lunar economy, they usually picture the dramatic stuff. Landers touching down, astronauts on the surface, maybe mining equipment digging into lunar soil. But every one of those activities depends on a layer most people never think about. The invisible plumbing underneath it all. How spacecraft talk to each other and to Earth. How they know exactly where they are without a working version of GPS out there. And how anyone keeps track of everything moving through an increasingly crowded region of space. That invisible layer is where the actual lunar economy starts. Not with landers. With the systems that let landers function safely in the first place. Let's start with communications. Right now, NASA, the European Space Agency, and Japan's Space Agency are jointly developing something called LunaNet. Think of it as an attempt to build something like the Internet, but for the moon. Here's the problem it's solving. Traditionally, when a spacecraft near the moon wants to send data back to Earth, that link has to be scheduled in advance. A specific dish, pointed at a specific spacecraft, at a specific time. As the number of active missions grows, that one-at-a-time approach becomes a serious bottleneck. LunaNet is designed to work more like the Internet does here on Earth. Spacecraft, landers, and rovers connect to a shared network, and data finds its way to its destination without every single link needing to be manually scheduled. If a connection gets interrupted, the network holds onto the data and forwards it once the path clears again. The same basic idea behind how email quietly reroutes around a bad connection down here. We've actually already met a piece of this bigger picture earlier in this series. Remember the European Space Agency's Lunar Pathfinder Relay and Firefly's Elytra transfer vehicle, both designed to support communications for far-side missions? Those aren't isolated one-off spacecraft. They're early building blocks of exactly this kind of shared network, what ESA calls its Moonlight program, aiming to grow into a small constellation of dedicated lunar relay satellites. This isn't science fiction on a whiteboard. It's already partly flying. Communication is only half of what a growing lunar population actually needs. The other half is knowing exactly where you are. Here on Earth, that problem is mostly solved. You pull out a phone, and GPS tells you where you are within a few meters, almost anywhere on the planet. GPS doesn't work at the moon. It was never designed to. Its satellites, and the signals they broadcast, are built around covering Earth's surface, not a target roughly 384,000 kilometers away. Which means every single mission heading to the moon today has had to solve its own navigation problem, largely from scratch, using ground-based tracking, onboard sensors, and a lot of careful calculation. That works, but it doesn't scale well as the number of active missions keeps climbing. That's the other half of what LunaNet is being built to provide. Shared navigation signals, broadcast specifically for lunar operations, that any properly equipped spacecraft or rover could use to figure out its own position, without depending entirely on constant, individually scheduled contact with Earth. In effect, a GPS system, purpose-built for the Moon, is currently being designed and tested by multiple space agencies working together. Communications and navigation. Two things you'd barely notice if they were working perfectly, and two of the biggest pieces of infrastructure the coming wave of lunar missions is actually going to depend on. We've already spent significant time in this series on the landers themselves, the intuitive machines, Firefly, and astrobotic missions currently flying, and the growing pace NASA is planning toward. They're the most visible part of this picture, but they're also, increasingly, just the customers of the infrastructure layer we've just described. There's one more major piece of the emerging lunar economy this series hasn't touched yet: what's actually on the Moon itself, waiting to be used. Scientists have confirmed something valuable sitting in the permanently shadowed craters near the Moon's south pole. Significant concentrations of water ice, locked away in regions so deep and so cold that direct sunlight never reaches them. Water, on its own, is useful for an obvious reason: life support for future crews. But split it apart, and it becomes something else entirely: hydrogen and oxygen, which happen to be exactly the ingredients used in rocket propellant. Here's why that detail matters so much. Launching material from Earth is expensive. Industry estimates commonly cite figures in the range of several $1,000s per kilogram just to reach low Earth orbit, before you even account for the extra cost of pushing that mass all the way to the Moon. If future missions could instead produce fuel, water, and even basic construction material directly from lunar ice and soil, a process researchers call in situ resource utilization, that could meaningfully change the math of operating near the Moon long term. To be clear, this is still an emerging capability, not an established industry. Various research efforts and early technology demonstrations are actively working on it, testing ways to extract and process these resources under real lunar conditions. Nobody is running a functioning lunar mining operation today, but the resource is confirmed to be there, and the economic logic for eventually using it is straightforward enough that multiple companies and space agencies are actively investing in the idea. So here's where all of this actually lands: communications networks, navigation signals, resource extraction, and underneath all of it, the tracking and traffic management challenge we spent an entire earlier part on. Every one of these categories has the same basic shape: a real, unmet need, created directly by more activity happening around the Moon, and, increasingly, private companies and multiple space agencies stepping in to build the systems that meet it, often as a paid service rather than a one-off government project. And this isn't a someday story. NASA has already put real money behind it. As part of its moon-based program, the agency has awarded contracts worth nearly $600 million to Astrobotic, Firefly Aerospace, and Intuitive Machines, specifically to build out this kind of lunar surface and infrastructure capability. That's not a market forecast. That's a signed contract. That's genuinely what a lunar economy means in practice at this early stage. Not tourism, not lunar cities. Infrastructure as a business, built to support everyone else operating out there. Now, you'll find no shortage of headlines putting a precise dollar figure on all of this. Different analyses projecting the future lunar economy at anywhere from a few $1 billion to well over $100 billion, depending entirely on which firm you ask, which decade they're forecasting, and whether they're even counting the same thing. Worth being honest about that range. These are projections, not settled facts. Different firms define lunar economy differently. Some count only hardware and services sold specifically for the Moon. Others fold in a much broader slice of the cislunar space industry. Some are measuring investment, others revenue, over different time horizons entirely. None of them agree on a single number, and this series isn't going to pretend one of them is the right one. But here's what doesn't depend on any of those specific numbers being right. More missions are coming. Those missions will need communications, navigation, and tracking infrastructure that doesn't fully exist yet. Someone is going to build it, and whoever does will effectively be running the toll roads and traffic lights of a place humanity is only just beginning to treat as a place, rather than a distant destination. Which brings us one final time back to where this entire series began. An 11-second fake video. A real rocket stage nobody actually filmed hitting the moon. A trajectory tracked for a year and a half by an independent astronomer with a laptop, confirmed independently by NASA's own tracking center. An object that couldn't be stopped, not because nobody tried, but because the ability to stop it had quietly disappeared more than a year earlier, the moment its fuel was vented and its batteries were switched off. A case built not from a photograph, but from a chemical fingerprint in a plume of lunar dust, and a before and after image taken from lunar orbit. A crater that taught scientists something real, and exposed a genuine gap in how carefully we're currently listening to the moon. A tracking and traffic problem that's only going to get more urgent as landers, orbiters, and relay satellites multiply. A patchwork of national programs, competing coalitions, and voluntary commitments trying imperfectly to keep up. And now, underneath all of it, the outline of a real, emerging economy, being built, piece by piece, by the same organizations trying to solve every problem this series has covered. The Falcon 9 upper stage didn't change the moon. It revealed how complicated the moon becomes once humans start treating it like a place where infrastructure can exist. Every open question this series raised: how do you prove an impact nobody filmed? Why couldn't anyone stop it? What did it actually teach us? Who's responsible for what comes next? Traces back to that same idea. We're in the early, unglamorous infrastructure building phase of something much larger. The part that rarely makes headlines, right before the part that does. Somewhere near Einstein Crater, on the edge of what we can see from Earth, there's a small, quiet scar in the lunar surface. Barely 30 meters across, 27 by the first measurement. Already mostly forgotten by the news cycle that briefly obsessed over it. But it may end up marking something worth remembering after all. Not the day a rocket hit the moon, but one of the earliest, clearest moments humanity noticed just how much work it will take to actually live and operate there. That's the whole story, for now. If you want more of this, the quiet, overlooked infrastructure stories hiding behind the headlines, follow this channel. There's more coming.